Good evening, everybody. Pleasure to be here. First, let me thank Advocata. Excuse me, I'll just leave my notes over here. Thank Advocata for the opportunity to speak to you on this topic of capitalism in Asia. Now, the last few public lectures I've done in Sri Lanka, including one for Advocata about a year and a half ago, have been very Sri Lanka focused. This one is quite different. This is not primarily about Sri Lanka. It's about the state of capitalism in Asia. It's a very big picture talk. It's fairly long and involved, so please bear with me. And what I intend to do is to look across the Asian continent, or at least a part of it, and do some comparisons between countries, ask some really big questions, and tease out some of the implications of what this means for Sri Lanka. That's the broad perspective. It is said about Argentina, that Argentines like to compare themselves with themselves. Now that reminds me a lot of Sri Lanka. Wasn't always the case, but Sri Lanka has become a very inward-looking country, and Sri Lankans, particularly the elite, love to compare themselves with themselves. I think it's good to look outside to see what good, middling, and bad practice is, and pick out the good practice and see what can be implemented at home. And that's the kind of perspective I would like to have for this talk. So I will start with a couple of idiot or kindergarten questions. What is Asia and what is capitalism? Then I'm going to look at what I think are the three faces of capitalism in Asia. First economic, then political, then global. And then conclude by saying what I think it means for Sri Lanka. Okay. So let me begin with that first idiot question: what is Asia? Not so idiot a question, because Asia is vast and diverse. The ancient Greeks divided the world into three. Greece, of course, was at the center of the world. And then up north was Europe. Down south was Africa. And everywhere to the unknown east of ancient Greece and its appendages in the Mediterranean was something called Asia. Just to look at the broad map, well, that's Asia, all the way from the Mediterranean to the Pacific Ocean. I can't possibly cover all of that in 1 hour or less. What I'm going to concentrate on is this part of Asia. So not the Middle East, not Northern Asia or the Central Asian steppe, but all the way from South Asia, revolving around India, through the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, to Greater China. By Greater China, I mean China plus Hong Kong and Taiwan. The Northeast Asian bits, South Korea and Taiwan and Japan, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. You can forget about the small Pacific islands. So this coverage of South Asia, Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, all the way down to Australia and New Zealand, is really what one could call globalizing Asia. This is the economic and political and international relations heart of Asia. It subsumes Asia's three most important polities and economies, that's to say China, Japan, and India. It's the bulk of GDP in Asia, and it's the cradle of international relations in Asia. That's what I'm going to focus on. That's what I mean by Asia. Now, the broad historical story is by now reasonably familiar. Asia was the center of the world for at least 1,500 years until about 1500 AD. And the rest of the world was peripheral. But that changed with essentially a European takeoff, starting about 2 centuries before the Industrial Revolution, and then widening thereafter. So if you look at this chart from Angus Maddison, I think it is, what you see is that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Asia had about 60% of world GDP, which roughly corresponded with its share of the world's population. That shrank to about 15% of world GDP by 1950. And what we've seen since then is an Asian re-emergence over the last 60, 70 years. And the broad projection is that by 2030, Asia, at purchasing power, will have over half of world's GDP. That's to say, coming closer to its share of the world's population, which is about 60%. That's Asia's economic re-emergence in the last half century or so. And that's how it breaks down as between China and India and Japan. So China, which was about 1/3 of world GDP, just at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, shrank to, what was it, 5% or less, but is heading back towards about 1/5 of world GDP. That's normal in a sense, given China's bulk in terms of population. India is heading back to about 10% of world GDP, closer to where it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's the broad historical story. Let me now move to that second kindergarten question. What is capitalism? Because capitalism is deliberately in my title. And I have to clarify that because, of course, different people mean different things by capitalism. At the heart of capitalism is this something called the market economy. Now, if you look at Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, what he means by the market economy is the exchange of goods and services, bringing together production with consumption, according to freely forming prices and with reasonably secure property rights. Those are the crucial qualifications: freely forming prices and secure private, personal property rights. Those enable the functioning of a market economy. But we then have to ask the question, what really animates a market economy? What connects it to politics, to society more broadly, and indeed to international relations? So if we think of a market economy embedded in this something bigger, we come closer to thinking about capitalism. Now, as I said before, different thinkers have meant different things by capitalism. And by capitalism, we're talking about market society in the world, not just about a narrow market economy. Probably the first book I ever read that was vaguely about economics, in my late teens, I think it was Robert Heilbronner's Worldly Philosophers. So when young people come to me and ask me what they should read about economics, as, say, A-level students, this is the first book I recommend. It's not an economics textbook, but it gives you a wonderful flavor of big picture thinking about economists. And the title of Heilbronner's book is The Worldly Philosophers. And these are some of them. Let's see how many you can guess. I'm not going to do a quiz here. But this is my initial 4. And they provide a kind of rainbow of interpretation of capitalism. So in the top right-hand corner, or is it left-hand? Right, left-hand corner is Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith never talked about capitalism, but his vision of capitalism as we now understand it was very much about individual freedom, what he called natural liberty. So if you give people individual freedom to produce and consume with secure property rights, then you have a flourishing market economy because people start to specialize. It's about specialization and the division of labor and the productivity improvements that come from it. So specialization goes deeper, and if you can do it across borders with freer trade, it goes wider. That's what economists call Smithian growth. It's not so much about technology. Adam Smith, even though he was writing on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution in 1776 with The Wealth of Nations, didn't see the Industrial Revolution coming. In the bottom left-hand corner, some of you might recognize this gentleman, but maybe others not. This is the German Friedrich List. Now, List wrote his National System of Political Economy very much against Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Because Adam Smith was a believer in laissez-faire with qualifications and free trade, about removing government blockages to entrepreneurial activity. List, on the other hand, argued that young up-and-coming countries, and he was thinking in particular of his own Germany, should employ protection and other tools of intervention to climb up the ladder in competition with the established leader of the system, at that time Britain. And that's an argument for state intervention and industrial policy, particularly to promote infant industries, so-called, that has been used for the last 2 centuries or more. Most recently in countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. And that argument even finds its echoes here in Sri Lanka. Of course, in the top right-hand corner, we find the very hirsute Karl Marx. And we are celebrating the 200th anniversary of his birth this year. Marx, who was one of the most brilliant thinkers of the 19th century, as an economist and as a sociologist, had an apocalyptic vision of capitalism. Capitalism has its inherent contradictions. He has 3 famous laws of capitalism, which will lead it towards its ultimate destruction, followed by socialism and then communism. And then down in the bottom right-hand corner is one of the great German social scientists of all time, Max Weber, the sociologist, whose vision of capitalism was very much religious and sociological. He wrote a famous book called The Protestant Ethic and the Rise of Capitalism. So there you have a sort of menu of different versions of capitalism, but that to me is the taster to this gentleman here. Again, some of you will recognize him, others perhaps not. This is Joseph Schumpeter. And my lecture today is very much going to revolve around this worldly philosopher and what his vision of capitalism means for Asia and for Sri Lanka. Now, Schumpeter was an Austrian, born in Vienna. He was precocious, famous economist even by his late 20s. He was Austria's finance minister when it went bankrupt. Just at the end of the First World War. He then headed a bank which went bankrupt in the early 1920s. He then became a professor to pay off his debts in Bonn and then at Harvard, and spent the rest of his life at Harvard. Schumpeter was arguably one of the 3 to 5 great economists of the 20th century, perhaps the greatest historian of economic thought of all time. But also a great economic theorist, best known academically for his works on business cycles and on the theory of economic development, best known more popularly for a book I would certainly encourage all of you to read, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, written during the Second World War. Now, Schumpeter, I used to lecture on the history of economic thought. When I lectured on most economists, I concentrated very much on their thinking, not on their personal lives, because most economists, like most social scientists, lead very boring personal lives. They have very few outside interests, and certainly their love lives can be written, as someone said, on the back of a miniature postcard or postage stamp. Schumpeter, however, was different. So I used to enjoy spending the first 10 to 15 minutes of a lecture on Schumpeter, churning out anecdotes from his thought and his life. And I'll just pick out one. He was a very colorful character. As you can judge from his dress, he was always a very suave dresser. Schumpeter said early in life he formed 3 great ambitions for himself. To be the best horseman in Vienna, the best lover in Europe, and the best economist in the world. And he said he failed in only one of those ambitions. He never mastered the art of riding a horse. Most economists are not capable of that kind of humor. least of all in this day and age. Anyway, back to substance. Schumpeter, to give you the essence of his thought, in a nutshell, as it were, three main things to bear in mind, which are very much relevant to what I'm going to talk about later. Firstly, Schumpeter's economic system is highly dynamic, quite in contrast to standard neoclassical economics, which is all about stable equilibrium. Its analogy is more from mechanical physics than from evolutionary biology. But in Schumpeter's system, the economy, particularly advanced, flourishing capitalist economies, are constantly changing all the time. Everything is being disrupted. It's disruptive innovation, which is, of course, a more modern term in popular use. Now, this being Sri Lanka and a majority Buddhist country, I think there's a very relevant analogy from the heart of Buddhism. Anicca is the term in Buddhism, straight from the Buddha's suttas. And anicca in Pali means impermanence. It is about constant change. So Schumpeter is, if you like, the economic equivalent of that, because his system is highly dynamic, always changing. First thing to remember. Second thing to remember is that the central agent of Schumpeter's capitalism is the entrepreneur. Now, the entrepreneur does not leap out of a standard economics textbook. He's not your homo economicus, your rational utility maximizer. What Schumpeter's entrepreneur basically does is beg, borrow, or steal other people's ideas. Some of you will smile wryly when I go through this. Ajit is already doing so. And turn them into marketable, profitable products, goods and services. So you take inventions, and rarely is the inventor the innovator, and you turn them into innovations. The difference between an invention and an innovation is that an invention is a new idea. An innovation is actually turning it into something for the mass market, which makes profits, which generates investments, which creates jobs and livelihoods. So we have a puzzle historically. Most of the really big ideas of the past came from China and the Muslim Middle East, algebra, the printing press, gunpowder, and other things besides. But they weren't innovated in China and the Middle East. They were innovated in Europe by European entrepreneurs in the commercial revolution and subsequent agricultural and industrial revolutions that Europe had, but China and the Middle East didn't have. That's a genuine puzzle. The third thing to know about Schumpeter is his most famous term, and this is really the heart of his capitalist economic system. He talks about perennial gales of creative destruction. Creative destruction is a term that comes from Schumpeter. So capitalism is not about stable equilibrium, it's about creative destruction, and this is how it works. New entrepreneurs swarm around new ideas, inventions, and they turn them into innovations at crucial junctures, in the process destroying old incumbent industries. So Microsoft comes along with a new technology and destroys IBM, for example, and Apple does the same. And in time, according to Schumpeter, they will be destroyed by the new entrepreneurs with new technologies who have nimble feet and who attack those big, complacent, sluggish behemoths. And it's this process of creative destruction. It has a destructive component, but a creative component. If the system is open enough, doesn't happen automatically, is the very source of our business cycles and of our growth and prosperity. In other words, we cannot have prospering capitalism without this kind of disruption, which can be socially very disruptive. As you can imagine from what I've just said, this is something that can upend politics, society, and indeed the world. So bear in mind those three things about Schumpeter that make his capitalism very distinctive. The dynamism of it, the entrepreneur, and creative destruction. Schumpeter, by the way, was the first major economist to use the term capitalism. Adam Smith didn't use it, Karl Marx didn't use it, Schumpeter did. And he was looking particularly at the most advanced parts of the capital of the world economy, first Europe and then the United States, to see how this kind of innovation was actually working. There's a great biography on Schumpeter. It's called The Prophet of Innovation, and it's a very accurate title. Okay. So I've set out my concepts at a bit of length. Let me now move to the material substance, the faces of Asian capitalism. And as I said, I have three faces: economic, political, and global. And I'll bring in another analogy here. It's this. It's the Hindu Trimurti, the conjoined three faces, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, each representing a cosmic force. It's the Hindu trinity of supreme divinities. Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. And there you'll have an echo of Schumpeter's creative destruction. So let's now look at that first face of Asian capitalism, the economic face. And to do so, we have to go back to a map I showed you earlier, which I've divided up into rich Asia, Middle Asia, and poor Asia. So let's go back to that map. This is from the World Bank. And if you look at the red bits, so that's Australia, of course, at the bottom, and New Zealand, and Japan, South Korea, Taiwan over there, and Hong Kong, plus Singapore. So 5 East Asian tiger economies, that first generation of tigers, plus Australia and New Zealand, that is rich Asia. Per capita income, according to the World Bank classification, of $12,000 or above. And that's the equivalent of the West in Asia. It's not actually a big part of Asia. In terms of population, pretty small. But that's rich Asia. Then we have Middle Asia. And by Middle Asia, I equate that with upper middle income economies. So that's economies with per capita incomes of 4,000 to 12,000 plus, according to the World Bank classification. And there are only 3 economies in that bracket in the part of Asia I'm looking at. It's China, plus Malaysia and Thailand. These are, if you like, the middle income trap economies. So where all these arguments that economists have about the middle income trap, as far as Asia is concerned, it's these economies, China in particular. Right. Then we have poor Asia. And poor Asia I have subdivided into 2 categories. There's very poor Asia, if you like, destitute Asia, which is low income, per capita incomes of $1,000 or less, of which now there are only, I think, 3 economies left: Afghanistan, Nepal, and North Korea. Right. Then there's, if you like, a more ambiguous category of lower middle income Asia, which is still essentially poor. It's not really middle income. With per capita incomes of anywhere between $1,000 to $4,000 a year. And that's the bulk of South Asia, including India and Pakistan and Bangladesh now. It's the bulk of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and it includes Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is at the upper end of it. It becomes more complicated with Sri Lanka for reasons I'll come to. So there you have our combination of rich, middle, and poor Asia. Now, to get a sense of capitalism in these different parts of Asia, where it's come from, where it is, and where it's heading, I need to present you with a simplified version of what economists call stages of growth. Because, of course, they're at very different stages of growth. Broadly speaking, there are 2 stages. One is the stage where you're poor and you're trying to catch up. So this is catch-up or input-led growth, what the economist Paul Krugman calls perspiration. So you're not so much using your brains here, you're using your brawn, you're sweating. And the challenge here, when you're a poor country, or a very poor country, is to mobilize what resources you have. Your labor, especially your cheap labor, what capital you have, particularly for fixed investment, roads, rail, and so on, and what land availability you have, to generate as much growth as you can as quickly as possible. Rapid catch-up growth, right? It's input-led because you're marshalling your inputs to the production process, land, labor, and capital. But there comes a time, especially if you're successful with this kind of growth, when you have to shift to a different model of growth. Because once you become middle income, especially in the upper middle income categories, your growth rate inevitably slows down. And this model no longer works. We're already seeing that in Sri Lanka. The population begins to age. You have less availability of labor, particularly cheap labor. Labor becomes more expensive. Capital becomes more expensive. Wasting capital becomes more obvious. Land becomes scarcer. And when that happens, growth rates really do slow down. And in order to keep up your growth rate and improve the quality of your growth, you then have to shift to, if you like, the second stage of growth, which is more about innovation, what economists call output-led growth, what Paul Krugman nicknames inspiration, because now you have to use your brains much more, less your sweat or your brawn. And this is the stage of the kind of capitalism that Schumpeter envisaged, Schumpeterian capitalism. Because this is all about improving your productivity. You want to improve the efficiency of your inputs, and particularly of your land, labor, and capital. So it's not so much the mass or the quantity of them, it's the quality or the efficiency of them. That's Schumpeterian capitalism, inspiration-led, innovation-led growth. Let's now match that to that map, back to that map of poor, middle, and rich Asia, and think of the challenges for each category. If you're in poor Asia, starting with very poor Asia, countries like Nepal, Afghanistan, North Korea, clearly it's not worked so far. And we know some of the reasons why, including states that have failed, war, famine, and so on. But the challenge there is not to move, to leapfrog all the way to innovation-led growth. It's about the basics. It's about catch-up growth, because they still have huge room to catch up. Similarly, if you're in the richer part of poor Asia, India, Pakistan, the poorer countries of Southeast Asia, there is still a lot of room for catch-up growth. You don't have to leapfrog, you can't, to innovation-led growth. You can still mobilize a growing population, particularly of young people who are uneducated, whose labor is cheap. There may be land to mobilize, there's capital to mobilize. So the model that's worked elsewhere will still work to a large extent in these countries. Sri Lanka is more complicated because Sri Lanka, still in poor Asia, but at the upper end of it, has limited room for catch-up growth. For one thing, demographics is going the wrong way. It needs to move to more productivity-led growth because it's closer to that middle income bracket, that upper middle income bracket. I'll come to that later. The challenge for countries already in Middle Asia, China, Malaysia, and Thailand, because they're now coming much closer to that frontier of catch-up growth, and because their growth rates are slowing down, they need to shift gear sooner rather than later to a more innovation-led model of growth. So for them, the priority of boosting productivity, to having more Schumpeter in their capitalism, is really exigent and paramount. And I'll come to some of their challenges in a little bit more detail later. Countries who are already in rich Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, are already beyond that catch-up growth phase. For them, the priority, like the priority for the Western economies, is to improve their productivity and innovation. Right? That's what it's all about. So there you have the challenges for different parts of Asia. For Middle Asia, the analogy is with Japan circa 1973, and with, say, South Korea and Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore circa the 1990s, because that's when their growth rates slowed down significantly, when they exhausted their catch-up growth and had to move to something else. happening in China right now, because as you know, the growth rate in China has slowed down considerably, as it has in Malaysia, as it has in Thailand. Now, second point I want to make here is that these stages of growth do not happen automatically. Of course, it matters what policies you have and what institutions you have. So let me talk a little bit about that. If you're in that first stage of catch-up growth, then the priority is, as I always say in my lectures to students, to get the basics right. Now, the manual for this is probably the World Bank's East Asian Miracle Report, which is the best-selling report the World Bank ever wrote, 1993, about the East Asian tigers, and writing very much about their catch-up growth before innovation became more of a priority. And the policies that they advocate could come out of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it's about Smithian growth. How do you improve your division of labor and your productivity? Well, getting those basics right means, like what Governor Kumaraswamy always emphasizes, you need macroeconomic stability. You need prudent fiscal and monetary policies and a realistic exchange rate. You need domestic markets that are not riddled with distortions. You need to have more competition than other developing countries. You need to be open to international trade, crucial. You need to improve your labor markets. You need to improve your systems of primary and secondary education in particular. You need to improve your hard infrastructure. Those are your basics. Now, Friedrich List would argue you need industrial policy as well to boost certain industries. This is much debated. I'm a skeptic, broadly speaking. We've seen it tried in the East Asian miracle economies and elsewhere. The record is mixed. The reality is that the successful economies of East Asia have grown from being very poor to poor and middle income, and some of them rich, by using a combination of policies from the Adam Smith and the Friedrich List textbook. Some free market policies, some interventionist industrial policies, but not really from the Schumpeterian textbook. That's come later. But what if you're in that middle income bracket and you want to go beyond that middle or escape the middle income trap to become part of rich Asia? What if you're already in rich Asia, like Singapore, but have serious problems, and to satisfy the demands of your population, want a better quality growth? Well, then you have to think of that second stage of innovation output-led growth, which requires a somewhat different policy mix. You need to continue to get the basics right. That's absolutely indispensable. But you need to go beyond that as well to improve the quality of your institutions. Now, in that first stage, as we know from Sri Lanka, even during the war years, and from India and China and elsewhere, you can grow fast even with weak institutions, corruption, rule of law, even some political instability. But when you come to that second stage, when you really need to boost your factors of production, your overall productivity, boost innovation, not only do you need to get your basics right, you need to improve the quality of your institutions. You need to improve the quality of your financial system, including your financial regulation. You need to improve education, skills, R&D. Those are all about institutions. You need better public administration. You need a more efficient judiciary for the rule of law. You need a more sophisticated legal system, an accountancy system, bankruptcy procedures, and so on. Now you see it gets much more complicated, going well beyond the basics. And you then get a whiff of how politically complicated these things get because they're more closely linked to the political system. I'm going to come to that later. So if we again match that to that map, which I constantly go back to, the challenge for poor Asia is to get those basics right. Because often countries, including Sri Lanka, continue to get those basics very wrong, to generate more catch-up growth. The challenge for Middle Asia is to not just get those basics right, but to seriously improve institutions, and particularly your three key factors, your labor market, your land market, and your capital market, for more innovation-led growth. And if you're already in rich Asia, then your challenge is to generate much more productivity and improve your institutions. I mean, those are the very broad challenges. Now, if we look at what's actually happening across Asia, what we see inevitably, given Asia's variety and diversity, is big variation. So if we just look at this chart, we see that China and India have obstacles in their product markets. This is according to an OECD metric that are much higher than the economies of the West, including the richer economies in Asia like Japan and Korea. If we look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, there are many other tables I could use, but this one for illustration. What you see, if you go down the list, this gives you an idea of the business climate and the institutions associated with it, is that only Singapore and Hong Kong and Korea are in the top 10 worldwide in Asia. And if we go to the top 20, we have, what is it, Taiwan, top 30, Malaysia, Japan, in the top 40, Thailand. And then it gets much, much worse, and the South Asian scores are very bad indeed, including Sri Lanka at 111. That gives you an idea of the variation. Now I'm missing one slide here. Goodness knows where it's disappeared to, but never mind, we'll skip that. So, I've set up some concepts and then matched them to my map of Asia. Let me now ask the question, still focusing on that economic face of capitalism, how innovative is Asia? Now, the challenge is this. I talked earlier about Asia's re-emergence in the last 50 or 60 years or so. But it's not been a re-emergence based on innovation. It's been a re-emergence based on catching up with the West. A re-emergence based on imitation, copying, which is what you should do if you're poor. You copy better practice elsewhere. The big question is this. Are we now seeing at least the more advanced parts of Asia, including China, moving from copying what the West has done to actually innovating themselves and doing new and different things and having that kind of process of creative destruction that Schumpeter argues is the central nervous system of advanced capitalism? Is that really happening in Asia? Is it beginning to happen? That's the question I want to ask here. And let me start with some broad impressions on a balance sheet of credit and debits. On the credit side, yes, innovation is happening in Asia. We see it perhaps particularly in the digital economy. The digital economy, won't surprise you to hear, is the fastest growing part of the world economy. Growing at about 10% a year, it's about 13% of world GDP. The biggest advantage that Asia has is young people. And young people tend to adopt digital technologies with greater ease than others. Lord knows I know that. As someone who has gone beyond the stage of being a young person. There are 3 billion mobile phone users in Asia. And of course, many of them leap straight onto mobile digital platforms. So you have a lot of innovation there. And you have companies, new companies that have been circling around it, including China's big tech companies like Tencent and Alibaba, Baidu, and so on. The richer parts of Asia have among the most advanced telecom infrastructures in the world. The country that's regularly ranked as having the best telecom infrastructure in the world is South Korea, which has been leading 4G. And there are companies to go along with it, Samsung. E-commerce, of course, has been booming across Asia, with companies like Flipkart, Chinese companies, and so on. So there's a lot happening in the digital economy. A lot of the talk about innovation these days is about China in particular. So people talk about China's new Silicon Valley, which is in the Pearl River Delta, revolving around the city of Shenzhen. China's in the world's top 6 tech companies, out of nowhere, have emerged 2 Chinese companies, Alibaba and Tencent. Another something I got from an economist report recently, the venture capital market in China for tech is now worth $50 billion a year from 0 5 years ago, or almost 0. The US market is only $60 billion, and the Chinese market is already ahead of the European market. We are, of course, now hearing every day of Chinese supposed innovations in wind power, electrical vehicles, battery technology, 5G, artificial intelligence, robotics, high-speed trains, and other things besides. How much bike sharing? Singapore has 2 Chinese companies that have completely inundated the island with these bikes that one can share. So these things are happening in China. The question is, how important is it in the aggregate, and where is it heading? Crucial thing is that this is happening in a techno-system that's very different from that of the West, because the Chinese government is promoting state-owned companies as well as some private sector champions in a much more forceful, interventionist, systematic way than we've seen with technological promotion in the West. So the implications of this for the rest of Asia are very profound. So that's happening, but let me now mention 3 negatives about innovation in Asia, which are significant, and which is why overall productivity in Asia is still way below that of the West, including China. The 3 big negatives are these, and all of this relates to Sri Lanka. First is state-owned enterprises. So by and large, state-owned enterprises in Asia, including China, are much less productive than their private sector equivalents, and also compared with public sector enterprises in the West. Let me take the Chinese example. It's estimated that the public sector in China, for all the government's promotion, maybe because of the government's promotion, is only about 1/3 as productive as the private sector in China. Public sector in China is about 1/3 of GDP, but guzzles more than 50% of capital and only employs 13% of the population. Those are indications of a productivity lag in the public sector in China, a drag on the rest of the economy in the aggregate. Second major negative is, if you like, the crony private sector. And by and large across Asia, private sectors are less productive than they are in the West, partly because significant chunks of the private sector, particularly in domestic non-tradable goods, are shielded from competition by their political patrons. Right. True in China, true in India, and elsewhere. Final negative is this. Productivity in small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in those crucial bigger SMEs, is very low across Asia, and there's a bigger gap between SMEs and the advanced companies than there is in the West. And you see this across Asia, even in rich countries like Singapore and Hong Kong. Now, if you think of those 3 negatives, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see how centrally they apply to Sri Lanka. A very inefficient public sector, a crony capitalist private sector that lives off rents, and of course very weak SMEs, all of which keep productivity rates well down. So all of this talk about innovation leads to something central called productivity, and I have a quote here from the famous Paul Krugman, where he says that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it is almost everything. Right. So innovation is basically about productivity and about your productivity rates, labor capital, and what economists call total factor productivity. So what is the broad picture of productivity in Asia? Well, this is a hazy area of research. A lot more needs to be done, particularly on sectoral and firm-level productivity. But I'm just going to pick out what I think is a very broad story. This is based on a Standard Chartered report from a few years ago. First, the good news. Productivity levels in Asia are better now than they were a generation ago. Now, that's not surprising because we've seen a lot of liberalization and opening up, and productivity gains coming from that. Second bit of good news is that productivity levels in Asia tend to be better than in other developing country regions, this chart here. But now we come to, if you like, the worst news. there's a problem with China. So for all the talk about super innovation happening in China, productivity levels in China, growth, has actually dropped considerably since the global financial crisis. That might have something to do with the public sector, with the crony private sector, with SMEs, as elsewhere. Productivity in Asia has fallen since the GFC, as it has in the rest of the world, productivity growth, that is. That's a worldwide problem. But this is the chart that I really want you to think about, because here we have a comparison between Asia and the frontier of the West. The United States, for all its faults, for all its problems, despite its present president, it's still the frontier, the benchmark for productivity in the world. So the US is at 100. Now, not surprisingly, the poorer countries in Asia, this is poor Asia and Middle Asia, are well behind because they're poorer. Right? As they get richer, you would expect their productivity levels to improve. But the real puzzle is why rich Asia, all of them, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Australia, Japan, South Korea, some of them with higher living standards than the United States, still have significantly lower levels of productivity compared with the United States. In other words, productivity is a problem throughout Asia, even in rich Asia. This is from the Global Innovation Index, which is put together by INSEAD, Kellogg, and one other organization. You have to take these indexes with a pinch of salt, but broadly speaking, only Singapore is in the top 10 in Asia, and then the scores go down considerably. There isn't a single South Asian country, including Sri Lanka, in the top 50 in the Global Innovation Index. Okay, so let me now come to a conclusion on this economic face of capitalism in Asia. My broad conclusion is this: beware of linear extrapolation, of thinking that what has succeeded in the past will inevitably succeed in the future. So the past half century or so, we've seen phenomenally successful catch-up growth in Asia, starting in East Asia and then spreading to parts of South Asia. And broadly speaking, the successful policies around that have been about getting the basics right. With hindsight, that's the easy part. Because if we're looking at the next few decades and the next 50 years, yes, there's still room for catch-up growth in the poorer parts of Asia, but not in Middle Asia and not in rich Asia, where future growth is going to have to come from better productivity. This is going to be trickier because we're talking about improving things like financial systems and legal systems, education systems, vocational training, R&D, which is more complicated, where you have to improve your institutions. Improving your institutions depends on your politics. And some of this stuff is very politically sensitive. So I have more doubts and more skepticism about Asia being as successful in the future as it has been in the past. And that leads me to my second face of Asian capitalism, which is its political face or its institutional face, because leading from what I just mentioned, my conclusion about the economic face of capitalism, one has to ask the question, what are the political underpinnings of Asian capitalism? What are the institutions like? Are they capable of delivering this shift to innovation-based Schumpeterian capitalism in the different components of Asia, poor, middle, and rich? Those are the big political or political economy questions. And that leads me to a little bit of talk on varieties of capitalism in Asia. Now, what I mean by this is, if you're looking at a particular country, whether it's Sri Lanka or India or Malaysia or China or wherever, what is the role of the state in the economy? How does the state interact with the banking system, with financial markets, with its manufacturing companies, with industry associations, with its services sector, with labor unions, even with NGOs and so-called civil society? That's the kind of mix of institutions of capitalism. And of course, you have huge variety in Asia, just as you have in the West. So are these institutions capable of delivering that shift to Schumpeterian capitalism, to more innovation? What are the obstacles? Those are the big political economy questions. Now, there's a literature, an academic literature in the West called Varieties of Capitalism, which is very much about these different types of capitalism in different Western economies. The standard book for this is by Peter Hall and David Soskis, called Varieties of Capitalism. And what Hall and Soskis have, this is my table here, the first two columns, they have two types of economies which they contrast in the West. So one is, if you like, an American or Anglo-Saxon type of economy. America, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, where, yes, the government does intervene a lot and accounts for between a third and a half or more than a half of GDP, but the government maybe doesn't intervene as much as in some other countries, and there's much more autonomy or space for business, for the financial system in particular, but also industry and services. And you have rather loose relations between the main actors, the state, banks, big firms, unions, and so on. That's a US-type economy, decentralized. They contrast that with a German-type economy, which they call a coordinated market economy. So here, you have much more structured, organized relations between the main peak actors. So the government collaborates much more with the industry associations, with the banking associations, with the labor unions, on particular sets of policies, on things like wage bargaining, industrial relations, regulation of financial markets. And there are, of course, shades of economies in between. You can't divide all the West into a US-type economy or a German-type economy. France looks different, Italy looks different, and so on. Now, if we now move to varieties of capitalism in Asia, the picture looks very different. It's difficult to use these two concepts, liberal market economy and coordinated market economy, and apply them to Asia or other developing countries. The only two economies in Asia that resemble a liberal market economy of a US type are Australia and New Zealand. And these are, of course, historically economies with Western people and Western institutions. It's the transplant of the West in Asia. Japan is perhaps the nearest equivalent to a German-type economy that's coordinated, but even then the fit isn't very good. Let's not forget that all Western economies are liberal democracies with historically mature, reasonably settled institutions. Maybe less mature and less settled at the moment, but that's another story. Whereas in Asia, we have the whole gamut of political systems, all the way from autocracy in China to democracy in India and Sri Lanka for the moment, and semi-democracies and semi-autocracies in between. And of course, much more immature, unstable institutions. Nevertheless, I think one can pick out something in common among the Asian economies, poor and middle and even rich, that's different from the kind of capitalist institutions we have in the West. Two things to bear in mind. Firstly, much stronger sense of hierarchy. So if you look in politics and government, and you know this from Sri Lanka, tends to be much more hierarchical. There's a big man usually who sits at the top, whether it's in a company or in the cabinet or at the head of the government department, the Sir culture in South Asia. Much, if you like, more pyramidal relations with the person at the top making all the big decisions and bossing everyone else around. You have that in business, you have that in government. Much more hierarchy. Second point, related to the first, relations between the two across politics and business, across Asia, are much more based on patronage and clientelism than in the West. So whereas in the West they tend to be mediated much more with checks and balances, industry associations, middle-level management has more power. In Asian cultures, countries, it's very different. So what Sri Lanka has in common with India and Malaysia and China and elsewhere is a much stronger sense of hierarchy, and across that political business divide, relations that are patronage-based and clientelistic. Businessmen do their private deals with politicians to carve out a particular this or particular that, rather than have things open, go before congressional committees, and so on. Right? So those are two crucial differences. Let me now come to some hard questions about these institutions of capitalism across Asia, regardless or notwithstanding differences in political systems. First is this. When you want to get to that second stage of growth, of more innovation, when you need to improve your institutions, yes, you need to improve the quality of competition in the marketplace, but also you need to improve your collaboration in some respects. Institutions need to be mature and stable and able to collaborate across divides. So if you're thinking of things like improving your education system or your vocational training system or your R&D, of course, a free market purist would say you don't need collaboration, but most realists would say that you need the state to collaborate effectively with companies and industry associations and unions. In other words, you need your productivity or upgrading coalitions. Now, there's a problem here. Less so perhaps in rich Asia, but definitely in poor Asia and even in Middle Asia. You have inbuilt resistance to this kind of institutional collaboration. One reason being is that these economies tend to have quite big informal economies. So informal companies are incapable of this kind of collaboration. Perhaps the more powerful reason is this. You have your incumbents in business, whether they be state-owned companies or private sector companies, who are sitting on rents, shielded from competition, doing their private deals with politicians through those patronage-based relations. The last thing on their mind is to improve education, skills, training, R&D, and so on. Because that means not just collaboration, but also opening the system to others and more competition. So they resist all of this. And therefore, there's a big blockage to these kind of productivity or upgrading coalitions. Second major factor is this. It's what I call the political economy of factor market reforms. Now, the story of Asian success so far has been very much about the liberalization of product markets, particularly consumer products. You look at China today, the market for consumer products is largely open, almost as open as it is in the West. A lot of competition among domestic companies with a lot of multinationals involved. And that's what China has been doing for the last 30 or 35 years. And that story is replicated across Asia. But if you look at the regulation of your factor markets, your land market, your labor market, and your capital market, you see a very different story going on. The Chinese land market is still very much regulated, with very restricted private property rights for farmers, for example. The Chinese financial system is essentially state-controlled and a kind of forbidden city with a moat around it, with the rest of the economy outside. It's an instrument of control for the Communist Party. The Chinese labor market is still restricted because China still does not have the full freedom of movement of labor across its provinces through the hukou system of household registration. Now, all of that is not accidental. China has liberalized the bits of the economy that are politically easiest to liberalize, that do not threaten the existence, the survival, and the future of the Communist Party. But now we come to a real conundrum. The party leadership knows for China to move to that second stage of growth, to have better quality growth, to be more Schumpeterian, to be at the innovative cutting edge, it needs to reform its factor markets. It needs a much more efficient banking system and securities market. It needs more efficient labor markets. It needs also more efficient land markets. Otherwise, it's still way behind the West. It's backward. But to do that, you need to liberalize your financial system, your labor market, and your land markets. And that is a real problem because now you're getting to the heart of the political system in China. Opening up a market for electronic devices is one thing. That doesn't threaten the party state. But liberalizing the financial system does. So we have a real conundrum because while the government says it needs to do these things, it's not happening. And it's not happening for a very straightforward reason. Politically, it's very sensitive and perhaps impossible. Because seriously liberalizing factor markets in China means loosening the grip of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party's categorical imperative is maintaining its monopoly of power. So we have a real contradiction here between the way China needs to go economically and its political system. It is not just a Chinese problem. Malaysia, also in that upper middle income bracket. The main obstacle to Malaysia moving to Schumpeterian capitalism is its Bumiputra policy, which favors the ethnic majority, the Malays, the so-called new economic policy. We'll see what difference the new government makes. I suspect not much. But Malaysia is really hamstrung because it has big obstacles in its land market, labor market, and capital to favor Malays, effectively politically well-connected Malays, which provides incentives for Chinese and others to emigrate, and which keeps foreign capital out. You have an analogous mix of problems in Thailand. Just think of Sri Lanka. We have huge obstacles in our land market, not least with the role of the state in it, in our labor markets, given restrictive regulations on firing in particular, and the role of public sector unions in particular, and of course in our financial market, again with the role of the state in it directly and indirectly. And these are political problems as much as economic problems. My third and final point now relates directly to political systems. And we come perhaps to the biggest domestic political economy question of all. So far, we've seen successful growth throughout Asia under a variety of political systems. It's happened under autocracy in China, before in South Korea and Taiwan. It's happened under democracy in India, and to some extent under democracy sort of in Sri Lanka. But the big question is this: when you want to move to a more advanced form of growth, with more innovation and better quality institutions, can you do that in a system that isn't a stable liberal democracy with an open society like the West has? Now, the complacent Western answer to this is no. You have to be like the West in order to become as economically advanced as the West. At the other extreme, you have the argument, which is now very popular across Asia. It's the conventional wisdom in China. It's the conventional wisdom in other parts of Asia. It's the conventional wisdom where I sit or stand in Singapore, that the Western model is now showing its weaknesses and may not be the right model for this kind of really advanced cutting-edge capitalism. Whereas the Chinese model, if you like a combination of Mao and markets, or market Leninism as some people call it, may be the superior model because you have direction from the top, you can coordinate, for example, your R&D and your science policy, your innovation policy, and selectively choose the best bits of market practice and forge ahead of the West with innovations that overtake the West. So there you have one version of how Asia will evolve, with of course, China in the front seat. Now, there is an important dissenting note, and perhaps the most important scholarly book to underpin this argument is James Robinson's and Darren Acemoglu's Why Nations Fail. They make, their core argument is this: if you want to move to that more advanced stage of capitalism, Schumpeterian capitalism if you like, you need to move away from the kind of institutions that Asia has. And they have a straightforward prediction: China is going to fail, because you cannot have a sustainable long-run combination of Mao and markets or of market Leninism. Why? Because these kinds of autocratic institutions are what they call exclusive and extractive. It's about hierarchy. You have small numbers of privileged people at the top in politics and business. It's not open. There are no checks and balances. It's not plural. It's not open to contest. So what do? They pursue their self-interest, which is to protect their rents, their political power and their economic rents. Keep outsiders out. That is not a recipe for undertaking those structural reforms which will bring more outsiders in and increase competition and productivity in the economy. And that will prevent China and other countries from escaping that so-called middle-income trap and becoming really advanced. To become really advanced, you need your institutions to become more inclusive, the term they use. More open, more plural. Yes, it's more difficult to get decisions done, but it's only through that openness and plurality, if you like liberal democracy in a very broad sense, that will you have innovation in the political system that can deliver reforms and innovation in the economic system. And I have a strong sympathy with that argument and a strong skepticism about the Mao and markets argument. So I think China may well fail for those reasons, but of course we will see. But to conclude this section, I think there are very hard questions to ask about the state of institutions in Asia. Are they capable of delivering Schumpeterian capitalism? Are they capable of having those productivity or upgrading coalitions? Are they capable of delivering those factor market reforms, land, labor, and capital? And is really advanced innovative capitalism in Asia possible under autocracies that are still in many ways closed societies? One final point I think is crucial. The Western experience shows so far that to move to that really advanced stage of capitalism, Schumpeterian capitalism, you need what Sir Karl Popper calls an open society. A society of broadly free individuals, free to think for themselves, who are the innovators and the entrepreneurs of the present and the future. Can you really have innovation in a society that's closed or engineered from the top is a big question to ask. So I now come to my third and final phase of capitalism, from the economic to the political, now moving to the global stage. And the context is this. The success we've seen, if you like, with catch-up capitalism in Asia so far has happened in a very distinctive regional and global macro order for the last 70 years or so under American leadership. But we now see that order changing in strange and unpredictable ways, and it's changing faster than most of us anticipated even a few years ago. Right. So let's ask some questions and paint some scenarios here. What about those last 50 to 70 years? What was that context which enabled the kind of success we've seen so far in Asia? Well, it was a combination of a stable security Asia and a stable economic Asia, and American leadership was central to both. If you look at the security front, yes, over the last few decades, Asia has had its little local conflagrations, the Vietnam War, wars between India and Pakistan, other things going on besides. But broadly speaking, Asia has had a fairly stable security environment, the geopolitics of Asia, and it's very much because of the leadership of the United States, not just as the global military policeman, but as the balancing power in Asia. What the United States has done over the last half century, with a combination of formal and informal alliances, with military on the ground in some countries like Japan and South Korea, and particularly through the role of the US Navy in patrolling the seas around Asia, is to maintain the peace in Asia and prevent China, India, and Japan from going to war with each other. On the economic front, American leadership and the multilateral institutions that the United States created have created that environment of progressive liberalization that has allowed first the East Asian miracle to happen and to spread to other parts of Asia. That's the kind of macro order of the past. But that is probably changing, and it's changing because the United States seems to be in decline and China seems to be ascending. There's a power shift going on in Asia. So the symptoms of US decline started probably after 9/11. The United States was so fixated with problems it created in part in the Middle East that led to a sort of benign neglect of Asia. That was followed by President Obama's leading from behind, as it were, a reluctance to lead in Asia and elsewhere. And now, of course, we have the phenomenon of Donald Trump, who is a gut isolationist and who seems to be doing his best to reduce America's footprint in Asia on both the security front and the economic front, which provides an opening to China. At the same time, we see China moving from being a rule taker, essentially adopting the international system the Americans created, and for the last decade or so, adopting a much more assertive role in Asia in three main ways. Firstly, China has been militarily more active and aggressive in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. In other words, contesting the role of the US Navy, the Seventh Fleet, in those seas. Secondly, China, only very recently, in the last few years, has been creating new parallel institutions to the existing global institutions the US initiated. Particularly its infrastructure banks. So its infrastructure model at home, it's exporting abroad through these banks and its One Belt, One Road initiative. Thirdly, China is recreating, in 21st century fashion, an ancient tributary system through very specific bilateral relationships of dependency with smaller, less powerful countries. A kind of hub and spoke system. So just think of China and Sri Lanka, where infrastructure projects are underway, Chinese companies come here, there's a debt problem, and China, whether creepingly or in a faster way, co-opts local business and political elites. And we see that happening across Asia. So those are the trends. I'll leave you with three scenarios. The first scenario is that in the decades ahead, we see maybe a modification, but not a transformation of the Asian order. It will continue to be American-led. In other words, America will recover from its present decline and bump and continue to lead the world and continue to be the balancing power in Asia, and through its leadership maintain a fairly liberal open world economy. That's one scenario. The second scenario is that there will be a significant power shift in Asia. China won't become the global hegemon. It's nowhere near being that. But it will become the regional hegemon or leader and replace the United States as the leading power in Asia. And that is perhaps the conventional wisdom today, that Asia will in effect have a Pax Sinica rather than a Pax Americana. Now that will be a very different kind of Asia with very different roots. We will move from something closer to liberalism of a sort since 1945 to something much closer to maybe the kind of mercantilism we saw in previous ages, with a much bigger role for the state in the economy. In other words, other countries will copy China, and much more Chinese intervention in mercantilist form in other countries, in their politics and economics, than we've seen in, shall we say, a more benign, hands-off American environment, American-led environment. The third scenario is actually worse than the other two. It's that there will be no decisive power shift, there'll be a vacuum. And a vacuum will create more instability and indeed lead to conflict, as happened in the lead up to the First World War and the Second World War. That's the nightmare scenario. So I've now talked a little bit about that external global face of capitalism. Let me make some very broad conclusions now, and then very finally talk about what this means for Sri Lanka. I realize I've been speaking for a long time, so I'm going to shut up fairly soon. To recap the three essential points from my three faces of capitalism. Firstly, the imperative, not so much for poor Asia, which still has a lot of catch-up growth left, but for middle and rich Asia is to move to a different stage of growth. But that requires much more difficult decisions on policies and institutions, which are also going to be more difficult politically because these get to the heart of their political systems. So that's the economic and the political face. The external global face is that we are seeing much more change in unpredictable ways, and particularly that power shift between China and the United States. 3 points to make here by way of conclusion. I think there's just too much lazy optimism about Asia's economic future based on its past success. And those hard questions that I've been asking, and maybe some of the skeptical conclusions I've come to, I don't think are sufficiently appreciated in Asia or indeed in the West about Asia, about the difficulties of moving to a more advanced form of capitalism, about the weaknesses of institutions in Asia, and finally, about the ability of China to lead in a constructive way in Asia. And particularly, I think there's far too much lazy optimism about China in particular. About China moving to a more innovative form of capitalism, I have my doubts. About that combination of Mao and markets, I have my doubts. And about China's ability to lead Asia as successfully as the Americans have done in terms of a combination of stability, openness, and prosperity. Now, I'll put my cards on the table here. Some of you know my cards already. I am a sort of card-carrying classical liberal in the tradition of Adam Smith and David Hume and Hayek, which is why my heart beats with Advocata, certainly more than any other think tank in Sri Lanka. And that heart, if you like, is about a combination of limited government, free markets, free trade, in an open world, all based on more individual freedom. Now, I think that a lot of the success that we've seen in Asia so far has been about the expansion of economic freedom, very much in the sense that Adam Smith described it in The Wealth of Nations. I think for Asia to have more of the Schumpeterian capitalism I talked about will require more economic freedom, which means liberalization, but better quality institutions that also require more liberal politics and a more liberal society. So I think, as I say here in the second bullet point, Schumpeterian capitalism, liberal institutions, open societies, and finally, continued American leadership probably all go together or fall apart. I do not think that Schumpeterian capitalism across Asia, with more liberal institutions, more open societies and freer people, is possible under a Pax Sinica, which is why I don't want to see it happen. I don't think that American decline is either desirable or inevitable. I think there is a battle to be fought in the United States for the United States to rediscover its rightful role as the leader of the world. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that America is on the way out. Just as I think there is a battle to be fought in Asia, in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, for the kinds of ideas that I've espoused here. So let me now come very finally to two main points about Sri Lanka. And this is about Sri Lanka's Trimurti, or those three faces of capitalism in Sri Lanka. Start with the economic face. Yes, there is some little room left for catch-up growth, but not much, because of changing demography, aging population, the need for more efficient use of capital, the need for more efficient use of land. So Sri Lanka needs to move to better institutions and also more innovation, not just focus on the kind of catch-up growth it had in the past. Its political challenge, of course, is to have that right combination of policies and institutions. At the moment, we have a government, like previous governments, that continues to get all the basics wrong without any structural reform for that second stage of growth. It's the worst combination, of course. Now, this government started by making things worse, by getting the basics even more wrong than the previous government. Then, of course, had to go to the IMF and has been very broadly sticking to a prescription agreed with the IMF on getting some of those basics right. We'll see how long that holds. But when it comes to the other stuff of opening up to international trade or liberalizing at home, not to mention structural reforms in the banking system, in the land market, in labor markets, in education and training, this government, of course, has done hardly anything. If you will forgive my French, some might get the impression it's done almost bugger all. And it's been, if you will again forgive the pun, a right royal cock-up. So there is, of course, a big economic challenge and a big political challenge that has not been met here. There is an external challenge. For Sri Lanka to have a successful capitalism at home requires an appropriate foreign economic policy and foreign security policy. And that's about balance. It's about not being too dependent on China. It is about having good relations with China, of course, but better relations with our civilizational friends in the West and India and other places, not least Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, and so on. And particularly, a strong set of economic and security relationships with the United States and with India. Now, this government has got it maybe 25% right because its political relationships with these other countries has improved. What's missing, of course, is investment from these countries in Sri Lanka to balance the public sector investment that's coming from China and the debt creation that's Chinese generated. So those are the gaps. That leaves Sri Lanka with, I think, a fork in the road and a real strategic choice. So it can sleepwalk its way back to a combination of illiberal democracy, state-led, very inefficient capitalism, ethnic chauvinism, and being a vassal state of China. In other words, it can sleepwalk its way back to a Rajapaksa restoration, which this government seems to be doing its best to clear a path towards. Or it can move in a different direction, which is about a better but more limited government, about freer markets at home, freer trade abroad, in an open world, and with strategic relationships with our civilizational friends. I think that's the choice that faces Sri Lanka. And those are, if you like, the main lessons I would extract from this very broad and long excursion around the capitalism that we see in Asia. Thank you.